The 1970s were an era of unparalleled glamour in Britain, yet for some, the bright lights cast the darkest shadows. We often idolize the stars on screen, but we rarely see the private battles fought when the cameras stop rolling. Today, we turn the page on 10 forgotten icons who tragically lost their way, surrendering their talent to the bottom of a glass. Their fall from grace was public, painful, and heartbreaking. Before we dive into these moving stories, please subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, do you think fame is a blessing or a curse? Let us begin. Eutha Joyce. The first story in our tragic countdown concerns a woman who was arguably the undisputed queen of British television comedy in the 1970s. To millions of adoring viewers, Eutha Joyce was simply Mildred Roper, the sharp-tongued, sexually frustrated, and domineering wife from the colossal hits Man About the House and George and Mildred. At the height of her powers, she could command audiences of 20 million people, making her one of the most recognizable faces in the United Kingdom. Her on-screen persona was fierce and formidable, a woman who always had the last word against her hapless husband. However, the reality that existed when the studio lights dimmed was a heartbreaking contrast to the laughter she generated. Eutha was a figure of profound loneliness and crippling insecurity, a woman who felt unloved and feared that her success was merely a fluke that could vanish at any moment. Behind the closed doors of her private life, Eutha waged a silent and devastating war against her inner demons, finding her only solace in the bottom of a bottle. She was what many would call a high-functioning dependent, consuming staggering amounts of vodka daily, yet somehow managing to arrive on set and deliver her lines with professional precision. She went to great lengths to conceal her addiction from her colleagues and the public, often pouring her drink into water tumblers or teacups to avoid suspicion. As the years wore on, however, the cracks began to show. Friends and cast members started to notice the slight tremor in her hands and the growing weary sadness in her eyes, but Eutha brushed off any concerns with a smile, terrified that admitting her struggle would destroy the career she had worked so hard to build. By the summer of 1980, the damage she had inflicted upon her body became irreversible. While filming her final feature film, her health deteriorated rapidly, though she blamed it on exhaustion. When she was finally admitted to hospital, her condition was initially reported to the press as hepatitis to protect her image, but the grim truth was that her liver had completely failed after years of abuse. Her on-screen husband and close friend, Brian Murphy, rushed to be by her side, but there was nothing that could be done. Eutha Joyce passed away 4 days after her admission, at the tragic age of just 53. She died as she had lived in her later years, largely alone despite the adoration of millions. The nation mourned the loss of a comedy legend, never fully knowing the depth of the tragedy that had played out right before their eyes. Jack Wilde. The second tragic figure on our list serves as a heartbreaking reminder of the curse that often accompanies childhood stardom. Jack Wilde was the cheeky, lovable face of the late 1960s and early 1970s, rocketing to international superstardom as the Artful Dodger in the musical Oliver. With his boyish charm and infectious grin, he captured the hearts of millions, earning an Academy Award nomination at the tender age of 16. For a brief, shining moment, Jack was the most famous teenager on the planet, commanding million-dollar fees and being hailed as the next big thing in British cinema. He had wealth, adoration, and the world at his feet before he was even old enough to vote. However, the pressures of growing up in the public eye were immense, and the young star soon found himself navigating a world of adult excesses that he was ill-equipped to handle. By the time the 1970s were in full swing, Jack was living a life that most adults could only dream of, but it was a lifestyle fueled by a dangerous amount of alcohol. What began as social drinking at glitzy showbiz parties quickly spiraled into a desperate need. By the age of 21, Jack Wilde was largely dependent on the bottle. The industry that had once embraced him began to turn its back as his behavior became unpredictable, and his boyish looks started to fade under the strain of his addiction. He was no longer the cute kid from the musical. He was a young man visibly struggling with a serious illness, yet the support systems for child stars in those days were virtually non-existent. He was left to drift in the high currents of fame without a life jacket. As the decade wore on, the roles dried up completely. The phone stopped ringing, and the millionaire teenager found himself spiraling into obscurity and financial ruin. Jack spent the better part of the late 1970s and 80s in a haze of intoxication, effectively losing decades of his life to his addiction. He would later admit that he spent years in a drunken stupor, barely remembering the days passing him by. It was a slow, painful dismantling of a prodigious talent. Although he eventually found sobriety later in life, the damage to his health and career was irreversible. Jack Wild remains a poignant symbol of the 1970s entertainment machine, a young soul chewed up by the industry and left to battle his demons in the cold shadow of his own past glory. Charles Hawtrey, the third story in our collection, focuses on one of the most eccentric and instantly recognizable faces of the British film industry in the 1970s. Charles Hawtrey was a cornerstone of the legendary Carry On franchise, known for his scrawny frame, round spectacles, and a voice that dripped with camp aristocracy. On screen, he played the fragile, confused little man who seemed harmless and endearing, but the man behind the glasses was a complex, bitter, and self-destructive figure. By the start of the 1970s, Charles was no longer just an eccentric actor. He was a man in the grip of a ferocious addiction to gin. While audiences laughed at his delicate persona, Charles was consuming alcohol in quantities that would have felled a man twice his size, often becoming belligerent and impossible to work with. His professional undoing came swiftly and publicly in 1972. By this time, his behavior on set had become erratic and aggressive due to his constant intoxication. During the production of Carry On Abroad, the producers finally lost patience with his inability to perform and his disruptive outbursts. In a move that shocked the industry, he was dropped from the franchise that had made him a star. It was a humiliating public dismissal for an actor who believed himself to be indispensable. Rather than serving as a wake-up call, this rejection only fueled his descent. Charles retreated to the seaside town of Deal in Kent, where he became a notorious local figure, often seen stumbling through the streets or causing scenes in public houses when fans approached him without offering to buy him a drink first. The tragedy of Charles Hawtrey was his utter refusal to seek help. He lived in a state of chaotic denial, his house descending into squalor as he isolated himself from the few friends he had left. One famous and tragic anecdote from this period involves a fire in his home. When the fire brigade arrived, they found a drunken Charles desperately trying to save his collection of pornography rather than his own life or valuable possessions. His stubbornness followed him to his very last breath. In 1988, after shattering his leg in a fall, doctors told him that his life could be saved if his legs were amputated to stop the gangrene spreading. However, realizing this would mean he could no longer visit the pub, he refused the operation. He famously told the surgeon that he preferred to die with his boots on. He passed away shortly after, a man who chose his addiction over his own survival, leaving behind a legacy tainted by the gin that ultimately destroyed him. Wilfrid Brambell. The fourth entry on our list exposes the heartbreaking duality of one of Britain's most iconic television characters. To the viewing public of the 1970s, Wilfrid Brambell was immortalized as Albert Steptoe, the grubby, manipulative, and toothless, dirty old man from the legendary sitcom Steptoe and Son. With his stained vest and croaky voice, he was a figure of grime and greed, yet the man who played him was a dapper, well-spoken gentleman who prided himself on his appearance. However, beneath the pristine suits and the polished exterior lay a man tormented by a secret he felt compelled to hide. Wilfrid was a gay man in an era when such an orientation was not only stigmatized, but, for a significant part of his life, illegal. This constant fear of exposure and public ruin drove him into the arms of a devastating dependency on alcohol. Throughout the 1970s, as the sitcom reached the dizzying heights of popularity with audiences of 20 million, Wilfrid was slowly disintegrating behind the scenes. His beverage of choice was gin, which he consumed in frightening quantities to numb the loneliness and paranoia that plagued his daily existence. Those who worked on the show recall a man who was increasingly difficult and unpredictable. During rehearsals, he would often be incoherent or forget his lines, leading to tense standoffs with his co-star Harry H. Corbett. The two men, who played father and son so brilliantly, allegedly loathed each other in real life, a feud fueled by Wilfred's erratic behavior and drinking. Filming became a minefield, with the production team constantly worried about whether Wilfred would be sober enough to perform when the cameras started rolling. By the time the series finally concluded in 1974, Wilfred was a shadow of his former self. He attempted to capitalize on his fame, but his reputation as a heavy drinker preceded him, making producers wary of hiring him for serious roles. His behavior became notoriously erratic. Famously, during an interview on The Wogan Show later in his life, he appeared visibly intoxicated, slurring his words and confusing the audience, a painful public spectacle of a once great talent lost in a haze. He spent his final years in a sad decline, isolated and battling the bottle until the very end. When he passed away in 1985, it was a quiet exit for a man who had once made the entire nation roar with laughter. Wilfred Brambell remains a tragic example of how the pressure to hide one's true self can lead to a slow and painful self-destruction. Robert Shaw. The fifth name on our list belongs to a titan of the silver screen, a man whose rugged masculinity and powerful presence defined some of the biggest blockbusters of the 1970s. Robert Shaw was the intense, gravel-voiced star who stole every scene in classics like The Sting and, most famously, as Quint, the obsessively fearless shark hunter in Jaws. To the public, he was an unbreakable force of nature, a man carved from granite. However, the reality was that Robert was a deeply sensitive and tormented soul, a talented novelist and playwright who often felt trapped by the very acting roles that made him rich. To cope with the immense pressure of his fame and his large, chaotic family life, he was a father to 10 children. Robert turned to the bottle with a ferocity that alarmed everyone around him. His consumption of alcohol was the stuff of legend, but it was a legend that came with a terrible price. During the filming of Jaws in 1974, his dependency was so severe that it famously threatened the production. The iconic scene where he recounts the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, often cited as one of the greatest monologues in cinema history, was initially a disaster. Robert attempted to perform the scene while heavily intoxicated, believing it would add authenticity, but he ended up incoherent and had to be carried off the set. He returned the next day, stone cold, sober, and racked with guilt, to deliver the perfect take we see today. It was a rare victory in a losing war. The alcohol was not just a social lubricant for Shaw, it was a way to silence the creative frustrations that roared within him. By the late 1970s, the physical toll of his lifestyle was undeniable. He looked decades older than his actual age, his face lined with the stress of his internal battles. He retreated to a secluded life in Ireland, attempting to find peace away from the glare of Hollywood, but his body had already taken too much punishment. In August of 1978, while driving home to his cottage, Robert Shaw felt ill and pulled his car over to the side of the road. There, alone on a quiet country lane, his heart gave out. He passed away at the tragically young age of 51. The world lost a brilliant artist who had conquered the box office but could not conquer the thirst that ultimately claimed him. While his character Quint was consumed by a shark, Robert Shaw was, in a very real sense, consumed by the liquid spirits he used to numb his pain. Tony Hancock. The sixth figure in our tragic countdown is perhaps the most defining cautionary tale of British comedy. Tony Hancock was not just a star. In the 1950s and early 60s, he was a phenomenon. His radio and television show, Hancock's Half Hour, revolutionized the sitcom genre, and he became the highest-paid entertainer in the country. He was the introspective, downtrodden lad himself, a character that resonated with every ordinary person in Britain. Yet, Tony was a perfectionist, tortured by crippling self-doubt. He believed that his success was precarious and that he needed to constantly reinvent himself to stay relevant. As the 1970s approached, this obsession, coupled with a catastrophic dependency on vodka, saw him dismantle his own career piece by piece, firing his writers and alienating his colleagues in a desperate bid for absolute control. By the time the new decade dawned, Tony Hancock was a man in freefall. He had traveled to Australia in 1968 to film a new series, hoping for a fresh start in a new land, far away from the British press that had begun to document his decline. However, the demons he was running from had traveled with him. His drinking had become relentless, a sad attempt to silence the critical voice in his head that told him he wasn't good enough. The recordings in Australia were a disaster. He was often too intoxicated to learn his lines, relying on cue cards and struggling to function. The man who had once held the nation in the palm of his hand was now a pitiable figure, performing in front of audiences who could clearly see that something was terribly wrong. The end came in a lonely apartment in Sydney in the summer of 1968, casting a long shadow over the decade that followed. Overwhelmed by depression and the realization that he could not escape his addiction, Tony made the heartbreaking decision to end his own life. He left behind a note that contained the chillingly simple line, "Things just seemed to go too wrong too many times." Although he passed away just before the 70s began, his ghost haunted the decade. He became the ultimate symbol of the tears of a clown, the comedic genius destroyed by his own brilliance and the bottle. For the British public, his death was a loss of innocence, a stark revelation that the man who made them laugh the hardest was the one crying the most on the inside. Keith Moon. The seventh story in our catalogue of excess concerns the man who arguably invented the concept of the rock and roll hellraiser. Keith Moon was the explosive, hyperactive drummer for The Who, a musician whose frantic energy on stage was matched only by his chaotic destruction of it. Throughout the 1970s, Keith was known affectionately as Moon the Loon, a prankster who drove cars into swimming pools and blew up hotel toilets with dynamite. To the press and the public, he was the ultimate party animal, living a life of consequence-free rebellion. However, beneath the headlines and the laughter lay a deeply troubled young man who was terrified of silence and solitude. Keith used alcohol not just to party, but to numb a frantic mind that never allowed him a moment of peace. By the mid-1970s, the fun had turned into a grim nightmare. Keith was consuming champagne and brandy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, his intake so massive that it began to physically deform him. The once handsome mod-style icon had become bloated and aged, looking 20 years older than his actual age. His addiction began to affect his unparalleled musical ability. There were humiliating moments on tour where he passed out mid-concert or could not keep the beat, forcing the band to stop playing. He was trapped in the character he had created, feeling a crushing pressure to be the clown 24 hours a day, even when he was breaking inside. His friends watched helplessly as he spiraled, his behavior shifting from hilarious to dangerous and depressing. In the late summer of 1978, Keith decided to clean up his act. He desperately wanted to get sober to marry his fiancée and revive his career. Tragically, in a cruel twist of irony, it was the cure that ultimately claimed him. Keith was prescribed a powerful medication called heminevrin to help manage the terrifying symptoms of alcohol withdrawal. On the 7th of September, 1978, after attending a party hosted by Paul McCartney, Keith returned to his flat, the very same flat where Mama Cass had passed away 4 years earlier. In a confused state, he consumed 32 of the sedatives, a fatal amount. He passed away in his sleep at the age of just 32. The world lost its greatest drummer, not to the party lifestyle directly, but to his desperate, tragic attempt to finally escape it. Ian Hendry. The eighth narrative in our tragic collection focuses on a man who was destined to be the greatest British actor of his generation, but is now largely remembered as a what could have been. Ian Hendry was the original golden boy of television in the early 1960s. He was the first lead of the iconic series The Avengers, a role created specifically for him, with the character John Steed serving merely as his sidekick. Ian had the looks, the charisma, and the raw talent to rival Sean Connery or Michael Caine. He left the series to pursue a film career that everyone predicted would skyrocket, but he carried with him a destructive companion that would ultimately steal his future, a ferocious appetite for alcohol. By the time the 1970s arrived, the man who should have been a superstar was rapidly becoming a cautionary tale within the industry. Throughout the 1970s, Ian's decline was shocking to witness. While his contemporaries were winning Oscars and enjoying international fame, Ian was accepting supporting roles in low-budget horror films just to pay the bills and fund his addiction. The alcohol aged him prematurely. His once handsome face became puffy and lined, and his eyes lost their spark. A poignant example of his fall occurred in the classic film Get Carter in 1971. He played the antagonist alongside Michael Caine. Although the two actors were roughly the same age, Ian looked 10 years older, a visible testament to the punishment his body had endured. He was known to carry a plastic bag filled with vodka bottles to the set, a habit that made him a liability to directors who once fought to hire him. His personal life was equally devastated by the drink. His marriage to the actress Janet Monroe, who herself struggled with alcoholism and passed away tragically young in 1972, was a volatile mix of passion and poison. After her death, Ian's spiral accelerated. He spent his final years living in a small flat in London, far removed from the glamour he had once known. He was bankrupt, lonely, and unwell. On Christmas Eve in 1984, Ian Hendry passed away from a stomach hemorrhage induced by his long-term drinking. He was just 53 years old. It was a silent, sorrowful end for the man who was the original Avenger, a talent of immense proportions that was slowly, sip by sip, washed away until only the memory of his potential remained. John Le Mesurier. The ninth story takes us to the warm, nostalgic world of Dad's Army, where John Le Mesurier played the effortlessly charming and vaguely aristocrat Sergeant Wilson. To the British public, he was the embodiment of the gentle, polite Englishman who never lost his cool. With his sleepy eyes and soft voice, he seemed to float through life without a care in the world. However, this relaxed persona was an elaborate mask worn to hide a man of crippling anxiety and deep emotional wounds. John was a man who found it impossible to confront unpleasantness, preferring to retreat into a haze of alcohol rather than face the conflicts of his reality. By the 1970s, his gentle sipping had evolved into a serious dependency that began to erode his health and his spirit. His reliance on the bottle was inextricably linked to his complicated personal life, which played out like a tragic soap opera. He famously allowed his wife to carry on an affair with his best friend, the previously mentioned Tony Hancock, because he was too polite to cause a scene. This passive acceptance ate away at him. He spent his evenings in jazz clubs, drinking until the early hours to numb the pain of his domestic situation and the pressures of stardom. While he never caused scenes on set, his colleagues watched with sadness as the man they adored slowly faded. His skin became papery and yellow, and his energy levels plummeted, yet he maintained his impeccable manners, apologizing to others even as his own body was failing him. The tragedy of John Le Mesurier was a quiet one. He did not crash cars or fight in bars, he simply drifted away on a tide of gin and tonic. In 1983, the cumulative effect of years of heavy drinking caught up with him. He was admitted to hospital with a stomach hemorrhage caused by severe cirrhosis of the liver. Realizing the end was near, he maintained his characteristic wit to the very last moment. His final words to his wife before slipping into a coma were typically understated. "It's all been rather lovely." He passed away at the age of 71, a beloved national treasure who had used his charm to hide a slow, heartbreaking suicide in plain sight. Richard Burton. The final and perhaps most devastating entry on our list concerns a man who possessed what many considered to be the greatest voice in the history of the English language. Richard Burton was not merely a star, he was a titan of the stage and screen, a Welsh miner's son who rose to become the highest-paid actor in the world. In the 1970s, his fame was astronomical, fueled largely by his volatile, diamond-studded marriage to Elizabeth Taylor. To the public, they were American and British royalty combined, living a life of unimaginable luxury. However, beneath the yachts and the diamonds, Richard was a man in the grip of a catastrophic depression. He was a scholar and a lover of literature who felt deep shame for squandering his talent in mediocre films just for the paychecks, and he drowned this self-loathing in an ocean of vodka. The 1970s marked the era where the drink ceased to be a companion and became his master. By 1974, during the filming of The Klansman, his consumption had reached a lethal level. He was reportedly drinking 3 to 4 bottles of spirits a day. He was so intoxicated during the production that he had to be propped up to stand, and later admitted he had absolutely no memory of making the film whatsoever. The public watched in horror as the man with the voice of a god began to physically disintegrate before their eyes. His face became bloated and scarred, his spine crumbled, and his once powerful presence was reduced to a trembling shadow. He was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle, attempting to numb the physical pain of his failing body and the emotional pain of his turbulent relationship with Elizabeth. Although he survived the decade, the 1970s effectively broke him. He had ravaged his constitution beyond repair. In August of 1984, at his home in Switzerland, the toll finally came due. Richard suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and passed away at the age of 58, though he looked 20 years older. He was buried with a copy of Dylan Thomas's poems, a nod to the literary life he had always craved but never fully embraced. Richard Burton remains the ultimate tragedy of potential, a man who had the world at his feet but found the burden of his own genius too heavy to carry without the anesthetic of alcohol. His story is the somber finale to a decade where so many bright stars faded into the dark.